To settlers along the American frontier, it was the ultimate horror, a fate worse than death, to be carried off by Indians. But for more than 2 centuries, it happened to thousands of men, women, and children. What was their fate? Speculation centered on bloody tales of torture, degradation, and savagery. But if the horror stories were true, why did some prisoners refuse the offer of release? Travel back in search of history with the families of the frontier and discover the inescapable forces that made them captives. It is 1682 in the colony town of Lancaster, Massachusetts. Mary Rowlandson, wife of the local minister and one of the few women who can read and write, publishes an account of her capture by Narragansett Indians some 7 years before.
Bullets seemed to fly like hail. Some in our house were fighting for their lives, others wallowing in their blood. The house on fire and the bloody heathen ready to knock us on the head. Mothers and children crying out for themselves and one another, "Lord, what shall we do?"
Rowlandson, home alone while her husband is traveling, is captured along with 3 of her children and a number of other Lancaster residents. Her captivity lasts just 3 months, but during that time she endures a 20-day forced march in the dead of winter. She sees one of her children, wounded in the initial attack, die along the trail. To Rowlandson, the Indians are inhuman. She credits any kindness they show her to direct intercession by God. After she and her remaining children are ransomed and returned home, Rowlandson writes her account. It becomes one of America's first bestsellers.
Captivity narratives, almost from their beginning in the very earliest of the colonial era, are immensely popular. These are being written in the days before novels are being produced, when people's options for reading material is very limited sometimes only to an occasional newspaper and the Bible. Indian captivity narratives had all the elements of popular literature today. They could be violent. They could show scenes of abject brutality. They hinted at rape. They were lurid. They were sensational.
They also have very shocking images. They have images of young women being killed, children being killed.
These images, part of America's first pulp fiction, make their way to the movie and television screens in the 20th century, become part of America's collective consciousness. The wild Indian carrying off maidens, cutting down men, subjecting captives to mysterious rituals and unspeakable torture. But how much of this is true? And how did it all begin? Before Europeans reached North America, individual tribes often fought one another.
Indians go to war for exactly the same kind of reasons that Europeans do. Indians go to war to defend their homes. Indians go to war to advance or protect their economic and political interests. Indians go to war with the explicit purpose of punishing their enemies. But Indians are also going to war with the explicit purpose of finding captives to bring back and to adopt into their nation.
Adoption is an ancient custom, a way to strengthen a tribe, both in numbers and in bloodlines. It is used to ease the loss of death by replacing the deceased with a captive and maintain the balance of tribal power. But that balance is about to shift. In the 15th century, the Spanish arrive, enslaving the tribes in massive numbers. To them, captives are property to be sold or exchanged.
From the very beginning, when Columbus came, and then when the French came, and when the Portuguese came, and so forth, each group took Indian captives. They took them, they frequently used them as slaves. They oftentimes brought them back to Europe, put them on displays in markets.
In the 16th century, the English and French moved their long-standing rivalry to North America. The struggle becomes territorial. Treaties and alliances with the native tribes are made and broken. Encroaching settlers move in, clearing massive tracts of tribal land. Between 1670 and 1820, isolated settlements become the prime target for captive raids. By 1780, captivities are so common that they are listed in the Pennsylvania Gazette, like the sale of livestock.
We have the following disagreeable intelligence. Mr. Benjamin Gilbert's house and mill were burnt and the whole family either killed or carried off. Another son with his wife and child are also missing. Samuel Dodson's daughter has not returned, and it is supposed she fell into the hands of the murderers likewise.
Indian raids could be the occasion for almost unimaginable violence and brutality. Generally, these raids take place at dawn against isolated, undefended settlements far away from anyone else. Usually the son and the father go out into the fields to bring in the livestock or just to begin their daily chores. They might be executed where they stand. The woman, if we read the accounts, comes to the door, and when she opens the door, Indians rush in and they bust up the cabin, they smash the furniture, they kill those whom they are going to kill, they take what they want, they set the cabin on fire, and that quickly, almost before it has begun, it is over. Before the smoke of the burning cabin reaches into the sky, these Indians have done what they've come there to do and have gone with their captives.
Europeans along the frontier are alarmed by the increasing frequency of the attacks. Ironically, it is their very presence that makes captivities more common, and to the tribes more necessary than ever before.
European settlement brought added pressures to the population of the native tribes. Smallpox epidemics that were brought in by Europeans sometimes could wipe out up to 80% of the tribe in a single winter. Imagine that 8 out of 10 people you know are dead in a few months' time. It made the adoption process all the more important to keep the villages alive.
When that many people in a culture die off, it's not just the people who are dying, it's the culture is dying as well.
For the Indians, adoption is blind to race or culture. Runaway slaves, Europeans, or members of other tribes are all equally eligible to replace a family member.
Natives practiced complete assimilation in their adoption, to the point of no longer considering you what you previously were. You might be born white, you might be born black, but you could become an Indian.
In the 1700s, as various European factions begin to fight each other on North American soil, the white armies provide the tribes with a new and compelling reason for taking captives: economics. The French offer trade goods to their Indian allies in exchange for British prisoners. The British reach a similar understanding with their own allied tribes. During the French and Indian War, nearly 2,000 captives are carried to Canada by the tribes. Ransom becomes a regular budget item in some colonial governments. To cash in their captives, the tribes march them hundreds of miles with the opposing military force in hot pursuit. This brings new danger both for the warriors and their captives.
It was important for both the captive and the captor, for their safety, for their protection, that they get back to Indian territory as fast as possible. If it gets down to having to lose a prisoner to keep everyone else alive, they're certainly going to make that sacrifice.
Those who can't make the journey may be weeded out with a single blow to the head. For the prisoners, it is horror upon horror. A sudden, brutal attack. Survivors separated from their families, loaded with booty, and forced to march. The exertion is more than they're used to. Their clothing unsuited to the wilderness. Food is scarce or utterly foreign. Their captors speak few recognizable words and give no hint of what lies ahead. To falter can mean death. To continue is to leave everything they know behind. For European prisoners, the act of being taken captive is the most traumatic event of their lives. The capture itself is likely to involve violence, fear, and physical discomfort. Yet many captives adapt to these situations with surprising ease. One such man is James Smith. In 1755, the 18-year-old Smith is clearing a road for British troops near Bedford, Pennsylvania. Nearby, General Edward Braddock is losing an important battle against the French and a force of united woodland tribes. As a triumphant war party of Caughnawaga Indians leaves the field, they capture Smith. They take him to Fort Duquesne, the site of present-day Pittsburgh. On the way, he is subjected to a common but terrifying captivity ritual, the gauntlet.
They formed themselves into 2 long ranks, about 2 or 3 rods apart. I was told that I must run betwixt these ranks and that they would flog me all the way as I ran. When I got near the end, I was struck with something which caused me to fall to the ground. They continued beating me most intolerably until I was at length insensible. I remember wishing them to strike the fatal blow, for I thought they intended killing me.
But Smith, like most who run the gauntlet, is not killed. The blows serve to appease the spirits of tribal members previously killed by the enemy. The ordeal wipes the slate clean. After this harsh treatment, the prisoner is eligible for adoption into the tribe. But unfortunately for prisoners, this is not the only option. Smith learns this firsthand when the prisoners captured in the battle with Braddock are brought in.
About sundown, I beheld a small party coming in with about a dozen prisoners, their faces and part of their bodies blackened. I stood on the fort wall until I beheld them begin to burn one of these men. They had him tied to a stake and kept touching him with firebrands and red-hot irons. He screamed in a most doleful manner. The Indians, meantime, yelling like infernal spirits.
Torture is seen as a means to test the strength, endurance, and purity of the enemy, and it is a way to ritually take that strength from the opposing tribe. Smith, marched to the nearby Caughnawaga village, expects a similar fate. As the warriors gather around him, his fears seem about to be confirmed.
One of them began to pull the hair out of my head. He had some ashes on a piece of bark in which he frequently dipped his fingers in order to take a firmer hold. And so he went on, as if he had been plucking a turkey.
Next, Smith is led to a river. 3 women from the tribe approach him. Again, he expects the worst.
The squaws then made signs to me to plunge myself into the water. I thought I should be drowned and that these young ladies were to be the executioners. I for some time opposed them, which occasioned loud laughter by the multitude on the bank of the river.
Smith is redressed in Indian clothes. The hair pulling and the washing have all been part of the adoption ceremony. The chief of the Caughnawaga explains.
You are now flesh of our flesh and bone of our bone. By the ceremony performed this day, every drop of your white blood is washed out of your veins. You are adopted into a great family. We are under the same obligation to love, support, and defend you as we are to love and defend one another. You are to consider yourself as one of our people.
Luckily for Smith, he was merely a woodcutter, a non-combatant. This may have been what saved his life.
Smith is given the tribal name of Skuwa, but at first he remains an outsider. His constant reading of a few hoarded books and his daily scribbling in his journal seems strange to the tribe and somewhat foolish. When the books disappear, Smith is sure his captors have purposely destroyed them. Only after Smith returns from a seasonal hunt does he discover the truth. The books were found while he was away and carefully protected and saved for him throughout the long winter. The gesture makes Smith reassess his captors.
This is the first time I felt my heart warm toward the Indians. Though they had been exceedingly kind to me, I still before detested them on account of the barbarity I beheld after Braddock's defeat, but I now began to excuse the Indians on account of their want of information.
But it is the Caughnawaga who educates Smith. As the years go by, he records the particulars in his journal: how to hunt and plant, how to build a lodge and hollow out a canoe. He learns the secrets of surviving in the wilderness.
When we had plenty, the hunters spent their time in singing and dancing. They appeared to be fulfilling the scriptures beyond those who profess to believe in them, living in love, peace, and friendship together without disputes. In this respect, they shame those who profess Christianity.
One winter, Smith becomes trapped by a blizzard in an isolated wigwam. With him is Te-Kare Tanego, a lame but respected elder, and a young boy, both members of Smith's adopted family. Their food runs out. As the days drag on, Smith is certain they will starve. Te-Kare Tanego tells him not to be afraid.
The Creator sometimes suffers us to be in want in order to teach us our dependence upon Him, and likewise to know the worth of the favors that we receive and to make us more thankful. Be assured that you will be supplied with food in the right time.
He has enough knowledge of the woods now. If he wanted to make a break for freedom, there's an excellent chance he could do it and get away with it. Instead, the feelings he has towards his new family are so strong, he continues his hunt, brings down game, brings it back, and feeds everyone, essentially saving their lives.
Though close to his adopted family, after nearly 5 years, Smith decides to return to white society. The Indians don't stop him. He takes with him his journals, his understanding of the natives, and their ways.
The portrait that Smith paints of his Indian captors is very complex and extraordinarily revealing, and at times very affectionate. But Smith is a complex man. He becomes a very well-known evangelist preacher later on in his life. And he, at that point in his life, he refers to the Indians as pagans. Smith seems to be appalled by the violence that he sees when he's a captive, and yet there is true affection between him and his Indian captors.
Ironically, Smith is best known in later years for his work in the British military as a colonel, training ranger troops to fight Indian style. In 1753, a disturbing frontier trend is identified by no less an intellect than Benjamin Franklin.
When an Indian child who has been brought up among us, taught our language, and habituated to our customs, goes to see his relations, there is no persuading him ever to return. Yet when a white person of either sex has been ransomed by their friends, in a short time they become disgusted with our manner of life, and take the first good opportunity of escaping again into the woods from whence there is no reclaiming them.
It's an assertion that seems indisputable. Attempts to westernize natives were, by and large, disastrous.
When you took these young children out of their own culture and put them into these white settings, everything was so foreign to them that it proved very traumatic on them personally. In many cases, they would run away from these schools and go back to their parents. In some cases, if they stayed in school, by the time they came back to native culture, they lost most of their abilities and skills in hunting and in warfare and things which the Indians highly valued and were, considered to be semi-worthless at this point.
But for white children who are adopted into Indian cultures, the prospects are more appealing.
There are many differences between the way a child would be raised in white society and the way a child would be raised in Indian society. White society then as now is dominated by strict rules, by schedules. Discipline is harsh and frequently applied.
Indian children, as adoptee James Smith observed, are raised quite differently.
They seldom ever whip them. Their common mode of chastising is by ducking them in cold water. Therefore, their children are more obedient in the winter season than they are in the summer.
Another period commentator made the point in his writings that if your children were ever captured by Indians, he basically said, don't worry about it, that there were certain things in Indian culture that might be foreign to them or hard for them to immediately adapt to, but generally they were going to be just as happy and just as comfortable and just as safe in that culture as they would be in yours.
The captivity narrative of Oliver Spencer, age 11, taken in 1792 outside present-day Cincinnati, is typical.
Spencer is paddling down the Ohio River when the boat is attacked by a couple of Indians. A couple of people are wounded.
Then, as Spencer tells it, the Shawnee warrior suddenly steps in front of him and makes an unexpected move.
Instead of seizing me violently, he extended to me his hand in token of peace. I took it, and from what I had heard of the character and customs of the Indians, I became at once calm.
What's amazing about this is that despite the enormous brutality of the raids, the act of capture is nearly always extraordinarily gentle in how it's done. An Indian will step in front of a white person and offer his hand and takes the captive by the hand. An Indian will step up to a white settler and place his hand on his shoulder. And that's the act of capture.
Spencer's actions and his age improve his chances for survival.
I think your demeanor when you were captured could certainly impact how the Indians perceived you as a potential adoptee. The Indians weren't looking for cowards to assimilate. They were looking for people who were bold or brave. And so we see some captives, when they realize that they have no hope to fight, to escape, a lot of times they'll come forward and shake hands or act as if they were happy. In some cases, captives had themselves read previous people's captivity narratives. So to a certain degree, I think people on the frontier may have been aware of some of the etiquette involved in captivity.
When the two warriors go hunting, they leave Spencer tied only by his sleeves. The boy easily escapes, but is ill prepared for survival in the wilderness. He describes a meal of raspberries and a cold, uncomfortable night. Then he hears the sound of his captors searching for him.
Fearing that if I waited for them to find me, they would tomahawk me where I lay, I determined at once to return to them. Springing up, I ran to the thicket and uttered the truly childlike excuse, "I have been out picking raspberries."
Spencer's captor, angered by the transparent lie, decides the boy has become more trouble than he's worth.
With a look of fiendish malice that almost froze my blood, he raised his rifle to his shoulder, intending to shoot me. At that moment, the generous white loon interposed, and throwing up the muzzle of the nearly leveled rifle, saved my life.
Spencer is brought to an Indian community near modern-day Defiance, Ohio, where the Auglaize and Maumee rivers meet. There, White Loon buys Spencer from the Shawnee and turns the boy over to his own mother, Kukachi, a powerful woman and prophetess who guides the Mohawk tribe's every action. Spencer recounts his first impression.
I could not help looking on the old woman with superstitious fear mingled with awe. I did not believe that she was divinely inspired, but thought it more than probable that she held intercourse with evil spirits.
Kukuchi at first is reluctant to adopt this rather bedraggled specimen of a boy. After a very short time, her motherly instincts kick in and she nurses him back to health.
As Spencer grows accustomed to daily tribal life, he soon gets a chance to prove himself.
Spencer is out hunting with a dog, and he and the dog run across a bobcat that's up in the tree, and the bobcat attacks the dog. And Spencer, who is unarmed except he has a tomahawk, wades right in trying to save the dog, and he kills the bobcat.
Kukachi sees this as a powerful sign. Spencer, she prophesizes, is to be a great warrior.
And to a 12-year-old boy, this is an amazing circumstance. Indians are extraordinarily successful about being able to acculturate young people into their society, and that's exactly what they're doing here. Spencer responds to that. From that time on, he is absolutely at ease with his new family, with his new culture, with his new home in the wilderness.
Spencer is with the Mohawks for 7 months when White Loon arranges a ransom. Spencer is eventually turned over to the French, who will return him to his parents. The boy realizes the imposing but soft-hearted Kukachi is sad to see him go.
She spoke of the happiness of my family, especially the joy of my mother at my safe return, then of her own regret in parting with me, having, as she said, begun to regard me as her child. She was affected even to tears as she bade me adieu.
Had Spencer spent years with the Indians, he may be like many others who simply refused to come out when the time came. People who would have been a person who would have been happy to spend the rest of his life with his adoptive people. The frontier is littered with people who had a foot in each culture.
Men are able to move more or less with impunity between Western and native cultures. Often called white Indians, these men are admired for their tracking and survival skills and are much in demand as explorers and interpreters.
Oftentimes when traders came into a Native American village to set up their trading post, they would take a wife from the local tribe. Their new wife could help them fit socially into the community, so they knew all the do's and don'ts when they were transacting with the various people. Some traders had a wife in the East Coast and then had a frontier wife at his trading post that he just thought of as part of a necessary piece of business.
Men could lead this kind of double life, but for women it was different. Any woman who was thought to have had sexual contact with an Indian, willingly or unwillingly, was seen as tainted. Even Mary Rowlandson, the author of the first captivity narrative and a proper minister's wife, feels obliged to stress the point.
I have been in the midst of those roaring lions and savage bears that feared neither God, man, nor the devil, by night and by day, alone and in company, sleeping all sorts together, and yet not one of them ever offered the least abuse of unchastity to me in word or action.
Tribal adoption traditions and incest taboos often protect these captive women.
The Indian who captures this woman may the next morning be her brother. This woman on the next day may be his mother, and of course they're not violated in any way.
Once adopted, true assimilation for most women was dependent on their age at the time of capture.
A lot of the older women, I think, wanted to get back to their families in white society. I think it would be romanticizing to say that these people who had lost their families loved Indian society and they didn't care about their husbands and children. But for a child or a young girl who was coming into these societies, they did offer love, affection, very strong family ties.
Within many of the native cultures and societies, women still held very influential positions of power. Often property was passed through matrilineal ties. In some cases, the women had essentially control or say over who were going to be the leadership, the male leadership of the tribe. And so for a woman going into native society as a captive, if she acculturated, she might actually end up with a lot more freedom and a lot more autonomy than she might have had she stayed in white society.
For those who have assimilated, rescue becomes another form of capture. One of the most disturbing examples marks the end of the conflicts between the British and the Great Lakes tribes. In 1763, the Indians are defeated, and the terms of the surrender are absolute. The defeated tribes must return their white captives, not just those obtained in recent battles, but dating back to the first skirmishes along the frontier, some 20 years earlier. A British commander on hand to enforce the exchange describes the scene.
The Indians delivered up their beloved captives with the utmost reluctance, shed torrents of tears over them. Some women who had been delivered up afterwards found means to escape and run back to their Indian towns. Some who could not make their escape clung to their savage acquaintances at parting and continued many days in bitter lamentations, even refusing sustenance.
But perhaps the most famous or infamous case of a captive who refused to return is the story of Eunice Williams, daughter of John Williams, a Puritan minister in Deerfield, Massachusetts.
That congregation was attacked in 1703 and 1704, and over 100 people were taken. John Williams lost sons, and he also eventually lost his daughter permanently.
Eunice is only 7 years old at the time of the attack. Her sisters are killed during the melee, and her mother is killed on the march after a disabling fall into an icy river. Eunice is separated from her father and 2 brothers. She is taken into French Canada and disappears among the Mohawk tribes. Repeated attempts to locate and ransom her fail long after her father and her 2 brothers are ransomed and returned. Her father tries repeatedly to see her, but is rebuffed.
I was informed that I should not be permitted to speak with or see my child, and that the Mohawks would as soon part with their hearts as with my child.
People in New England were terribly shocked that Eunice never came back. It became an extremely important story because Eunice represented this Puritan world.
Nearly a decade passes. In 1713, a merchant well connected with the northern tribes is recruited to bargain for Eunice's return. A meeting is arranged with 17-year-old Eunice, but she arrives with an Indian husband.
She was bashful in the face, but proved harder than steel in her breast. She did not speak. Had I made such proposals in praise to the worst of Indians, I would have had a more reasonable answer.
Eunice's reasons were hers alone. Yet there is one account that sheds light on the lives of those, like Eunice, who chose not to return. It is the case of Mary Jemison, who spent nearly 80 years among the Seneca and then told her life story to the white world she left behind.
One of the things that makes Jemison's captivity so unique is that it is recorded at all. She never did escape and actually didn't want to. She assimilated into the culture and was interviewed as an old woman and left us this wonderful detailed account.
It is the spring of 1758. 13-year-old Mary Jemison and her Irish-born family are living on a farm in western Pennsylvania.
What they don't realize is that they're living in a war zone. And in 1758, their family is attacked, and some of the members of the family and friends are killed on the spot. Jemison, her mother, and some of the party are captured by Shawnees and French.
Fearing pursuit, the captors push the party at a brisk pace. Some of the prisoners begin to despair and falter. On the trail, the war party stops to rest. Mary's shoes and stockings are removed and replaced with moccasins. The rest of the family is left in their homespun clothing. Mary's mother grasps the meaning of the gesture.
Remember your own name. Remember the English tongue. But if you shall have an opportunity to get away from the Indians, don't try to escape, for if you do, they will find and destroy you.
Mary is led away. The march resumes. Later, Mary sees several scalps stretched and dried before the fire. The length and color of the hair are all too familiar.
In the course of the night, they made me to understand that they should not have killed my family if the whites had not pursued them.
After 5 grueling days, the war party arrives at Fort Duquesne in Pennsylvania. Mary's face is painted and her hair is combed. She is examined by 2 older women. They are Senecas, a branch of the Iroquois tribe. An agreement is reached. Mary is taken to the Senecas' summer village along the Ohio River. She does not know it yet, but the women who claim her have the ultimate say in her fate.
In Iroquois society, for example, women had a considerable amount of power. They also were very important in terms of these captive issues, in terms of deciding who was going to be adopted into their own family. And the captive, whether it was a male child or a female child or a young adult, was chosen by the woman of the family.
Once at the village, Mary's clothes, now worn to rags, are replaced with Indian dress. The women of the tribe welcome her. Mary is to be adopted for a very specific reason.
Our brother is dead. He has seen our distress and sent us a helper. Let us receive her with joy. She is our sister. In the place of our brother, she stands in our tribe.
The idea of replacing lost family members with these white captives isn't always a one-to-one proposition. We often find that you might have a man, in essence, filling the place of a woman, or a child replacing an elderly individual in the family. The advantage for the captive in these kinds of situations is that most often you, in essence, inherit the honors or titles of the individual you replace. So even though you might be a 15-year-old boy, if you're replacing a high-ranking individual of a more elderly status, you get a certain amount of his prestige comes with the job.
Mary soon adapts to the routine of the village and comes to love her adopted family.
The warmth of their feelings The kind reception which I met with and the continued favors that I received at their hands riveted my affection for them so strongly that I am constrained to believe that I loved them as I should have loved my own sister had she lived.
But when her sisters arrange a marriage for her, Mary is hesitant.
The idea of spending my days with him at first seemed perfectly irreconcilable to my feelings, but his good nature, generosity, tenderness, and friendship toward me soon gained my affection.
When Mary has children, she abandons all thought of returning to white society.
I had a large family of Indian children that I must take with me, and if I should be so fortunate as to find my relatives, they would despise them, if not myself, and treat us as enemies, or at least with a degree of cold indifference which I could not endure.
Instead, she chooses to grow old among the Seneca, retreating with them as their land is slowly taken away. Near the end of her life, Mary Jemison, now in her 80s, trudges several arduous miles from her Seneca home to visit a white neighbor, a doctor and writer named John Seaver. Mary, whose mother's last words were to urge her never to forget the English language, comes to tell him her life story. The account remains the only one of its kind. At the start of the 19th century, captivity narratives begin to change. Once the returned captive has told his or her story, each with their own omissions, misinterpretations, or embellishments, the editors and publishers take things a step further. Mary Jemison's second husband, a Seneca warrior named Hiokatu, is one of the first targets.
One of the most egregious examples of editorial license is in the case of the Mary Jemison story, where James Seaver was obviously not getting what he wanted from Jemison. And so he goes to a person who is allegedly her cousin, and turns out not to be her cousin at all, who says terrible things about her husband Hiokatu. And those things are just lifted and put as a whole chapter into the book as if she said them, and she didn't say them at all. She says about her husband that he was a very kind husband to her.
Although war was his trade from his youth to old age, he uniformly treated me with tenderness and never offered an insult.
Other publishers take the practice much further, blending fact with fiction and sometimes presenting fiction as fact. Increasingly violent images emerge. Babies are roasted in skillets, thrown into boiling water, eaten by dogs, or dashed against rocks. Women are burned alive, dismembered, devoured, and for the first time, raped.
Okay, we really want to look at why these things were done the way they were done and what they mean. And I think that what they mean is that if you make Indians look more and more brutal, then it's all right to come in and take their land.
Some of these accounts very clearly are written in such a way that they're going to be used to justify military action taken against native peoples throughout the frontier region.
In addition to these tales of horror, dime novels, the tabloids of their day, exploit America's hunger for homegrown heroes. Indians and Indian fighters like Daniel Boone are common subjects, depicted in terms of good versus evil. The roles are cast: the white hero, the damsel in distress, and playing the part of the villain, the Indian. It is a hierarchy that will remain virtually unchallenged for more than a century. Today, with Western civilization firmly established, the pendulum has, to a degree, swung back, but the images of captivity remain. Movies like Dances with Wolves still give us the beautiful white damsel and the white hero, but this time the bloodthirsty savages have been replaced by a wholly sympathetic and spiritual tribe. The lurid rape images of the 19th century have been supplanted by equally titillating romance novels. But now the captive longs to be carried off in the arms of her Indian captor. The details of the original narratives are now largely forgotten, and certainly few now remember the ending to the most famous captive story of its day, the unredeemed Eunice Williams. The woman who was coldly memorialized with a plaque that reads, "Eunice Williams married a savage and then became one," has another memorial. Years after her death, her children's children returned to Deerfield to visit the graves of their white forefathers. To mark that occasion in 1837, the reverend of the town, in the church where Eunice's father once preached, gives a sermon. He addresses both the Indian descendants of Eunice and her white cousins.
We must consider this remarkable illustration of the truth, by which the blood of two races so distinct and unlike, and once so hostile and irreconcilable, has been blended together. We must recognize with pious humility the workings of mysterious providence which has mingled your blood with ours, and which admonishes us that God hath made of one blood all nations of men.